They called it Vietnam, a place where the jungle swallowed everything. Men, machines, and sometimes even their souls. In the mid-1960s, deep in the heart of Southeast Asia, a new kind of war was beginning, one unlike anything the world had seen before. It wasn't about tanks rolling across Europe or armies clashing on open fields. This was a war fought in silence, in shadows, and in the endless green of a jungle that never slept. After the devastation of World War II, the United States emerged as a superpower, determined to stop the spread of communism. And when a small country called Vietnam began to fall into conflict, Washington believed it was the next domino to fall. North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, was fighting for unification under communism. South Vietnam, backed by America, struggled to resist. And so in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson made the decision that would change history, to send U.S. combat troops into Vietnam. It was meant to be quick. It was meant to show American strength, but the soldiers who landed there soon realized this wasn't just another war. From the moment they stepped off the helicopters, the heat hit them like a wall. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mud and rot. The jungle was alive, buzzing, hissing, whispering. But somewhere in that darkness, unseen eyes were watching the Viet Cong. They weren't a conventional army. No uniforms, no bases, no front lines. They were ghosts, masters of ambush, blending into the terrain, striking without warning, then vanishing as if the earth itself had swallowed them. For the young American soldiers, many barely out of high school, this was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Every step could hide a trap. Every sound could be an enemy. And the jungle never ended. At first, America believed its superior firepower would crush the enemy quickly. Jets bombed the forests. Artillery thundered day and night. Napalm turned the green jungle into fields of fire. But when the smoke cleared, the enemy was still there, waiting. The soldiers began to understand that the jungle itself was the enemy. Rain poured for weeks. Leeches crawled beneath their uniforms. Malaria spread faster than bullets. And the line between friend and foe blurred in the thick mist of the trees. By late 1965, entire battalions were being sent into dense jungles with no clear objectives, searching for enemies they couldn't see, fighting for villages that would be lost again the next day. And slowly, doubt began to grow. Why were they here? Who were they really fighting for? And what did victory even mean in a place like this? For many, Vietnam became less about politics and more about survival. Each day was a test to make it through the patrols, the ambushes, the heat, the fear. Some soldiers wrote home pretending everything was fine. Others stayed silent, knowing no one back home could ever understand what they were living through. But even in the darkest jungles, courage refused to die. There were stories of brotherhood, of soldiers carrying their wounded through rivers of blood, stories of medics who ran through fire to save their men, and stories of those who refused to give up, even when surrounded, even when hope was gone, because for them, giving up meant disappearing forever into the jungle. By the end of 1966, more than 400,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The war was no longer just a conflict. It had become a storm with no direction, no end. And deep inside those jungles, something was changing. The enemy was learning, adapting, and striking harder than ever before. What started as a mission to stop communism was turning into a nightmare the world couldn't escape. In Vietnam, victory wasn't measured by territory gained, but by how many men came back alive. The jungle had claimed its first souls, and the war was just beginning. In Vietnam, you didn't see the enemy, you felt him. By 1967, American troops had learned that the Vietnam War wasn't a war of territory, it was a war of ghosts. The Viet Cong didn't fight in the open. They didn't march in formation or wear shining medals. They melted into the jungle. Invisible, patient, deadly. The jungles of Vietnam were a maze. Thick vines wrapped around trees like serpents. Visibility was measured in meters, not miles. Every step forward could mean life or death. The Viet Cong had turned this terrain into their weapon. They dug vast underground networks, tunnels stretching for miles, hidden beneath rice fields and villages. Inside them were command centers, weapon caches, hospitals, even sleeping quarters. Entire armies disappeared underground. Moving through the earth like shadows, American patrols would walk over the ground, unaware that beneath their boots, hundreds of enemy soldiers were watching, waiting. When the time came, they struck fast. A burst of gunfire, a mine exploding from nowhere. And then silence. For the soldiers caught in these ambushes, it was terror unlike anything they had imagined. You could fire back, but at what? You couldn't see the enemy. You couldn't even hear him coming. The jungle swallowed every sound, except your heartbeat. To fight an enemy you couldn't see, the U.S. military unleashed overwhelming firepower. Helicopters rained bullets through the trees. Jets bombed entire forests with napalm. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were burned to the ground. The Americans called it search and destroy, but for many it felt more like search and survive. Still, the Viet Cong kept coming. Their traps were simple but horrifying: sharpened bamboo spikes hidden under leaves, grenades wired to tripwires, mines disguised as toys. Every step forward was a gamble, and every explosion meant another soldier lost, another friend gone. Many soldiers began to fear the jungle more than the enemy. The rain never stopped. The mud swallowed your boots. Leeches crawled up your legs while you slept. And at night, when the sounds of insects faded, you could almost hear whispers in the dark, echoes of those who had vanished. But despite the fear, the soldiers fought on. They adapted. They learned to move silently, to listen for the smallest rustle, to trust their instincts. Friendships grew stronger than blood, because in that world, you didn't fight for politics. You fought for the man beside you. Sometimes, victory wasn't about winning a battle. It was about surviving the day, bringing your squad back alive, writing one more letter home. And yet even those small victories felt hollow. The jungle gave nothing back. You could take a hill one day and lose it the next. You could wipe out a village, and still, the enemy would return, like ghosts rising from the earth. In the chaos, morale began to crumble. Soldiers questioned the mission. Why were they fighting people who didn't wear uniforms? Why were they burning villages of farmers who looked no different from the enemy? Many began to realize this wasn't a war America could win with bombs and bullets, because this wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for belief. The Viet Cong weren't just defending a country. They were defending their home, their soil, their right to exist. And for them, that made every sacrifice worth it. By 1968, the American Army had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than on all of Europe during World War II. Entire jungles had been erased from the map, but the enemy still stood, still fought, still disappeared into the mist when the smoke cleared. In Vietnam, there were no front lines, only the line between life and death. The soldiers had entered a war that had no face and no end. And as months turned into years, the toll of that endless fight began to break even the strongest among them. In Vietnam, death came quietly, and it never knocked twice. By 1969, the jungles of Vietnam had become a graveyard. Each day bled into the next. The same rain, the same mud, the same war. For the soldiers on the ground, time had no meaning. You lived minute to minute, heartbeat to heartbeat. When contact came, it came fast. A rustle in the brush, a flash of movement. Then, gunfire. The sound was deafening, echoing through the trees like thunder in a storm. Men hit the ground, firing blindly into the jungle. You didn't aim. You reacted, because by the time you saw the enemy, it was already too late. The firefights were chaos. Loud, confusing, terrifying. Smoke, blood, shouting. The jungle swallowed the screams of the wounded, and when it was over, the silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever did. You could win a battle and still feel like you'd lost. Because when the smoke cleared, someone you knew was gone. Sometimes a friend. Sometimes the one who saved your life a week ago. They said courage was doing your duty even when you were afraid. But in Vietnam, everyone was afraid. You just learned to hide it. Every man had his way of coping. Some smoked, some prayed, some stared blankly into the fire at night, wondering if they'd see another sunrise. Letters from home became sacred. They were folded and refolded until the paper tore. Because when everything around you was chaos, those words, from a wife, a mother, a friend, reminded you that the world still existed somewhere beyond the jungle. But war has a way of changing people. The longer you stayed, the harder it was to remember who you were before. Some soldiers became hardened, emotionless, machines built to survive. Others broke quietly. You could see it in their eyes, that empty stare, that 1,000-yard look that said, "I'm still here, but part of me isn't." Night was the worst. You'd lie in your foxhole, soaked to the bone, listening to the rain, the hum of mosquitoes, and the whispers of your own fear. Every sound felt like a threat. A snapping branch could be a wild animal, or an ambush waiting in the dark. Sleep became a luxury. Dreams were filled with gunfire. And even when the shooting stopped, The war followed you in your mind. There were moments, rare and fragile, when the war seemed far away. When the rain would stop, the jungle would glow with sunlight filtering through the canopy, and for a second, it was almost peaceful. But peace never lasted, because just as you began to feel human again, the radio would crackle, the order would come, "Move out! We've got contact up ahead." And once again, the nightmare began. Some soldiers tried to find meaning in it all. They told themselves they were fighting for freedom, for democracy, for America. But others weren't so sure anymore. They began to ask, whose freedom? Whose victory? Whose war is this really? The deeper they went into the jungle, the less the war made sense. They weren't fighting for land or cities. They were fighting to survive a war that no longer seemed to have a purpose. And slowly, something inside them began to change. The jungle didn't just hide the enemy. It consumed the soldiers too. It ate away at their hope, their sanity, their souls. By 1970, the U.S. had lost more than 30,000 men. But numbers meant nothing to those still out there, because every loss had a name, a face, a story. And for those who survived, the guilt was heavier than their rifles. Why him? Why not me? Questions that echoed long after the war was over. In Vietnam, you didn't fight for your country. You fought for your brothers. And when they fell, part of you fell with them. That was the true cost of the Vietnam War. Not the territory, not the politics, but the souls of the men who went in young and came out old. Every war has an ending, but not every war ends in victory. By the early 1970s, America had been fighting in Vietnam for nearly a decade. The jungle had claimed thousands of lives. The fire, the blood, the rain, all of it had begun to feel endless, and finally, the world began to ask the same question the soldiers had whispered for years. Why are we still here? At home, the protests grew louder. Young Americans filled the streets, demanding an end to the war. Television screens showed burning villages, crying children, soldiers with haunted eyes. The truth could no longer be hidden. Vietnam was not a war of heroes and villains, it was a tragedy. A story of lives lost in a place that few back home could even find on a map. By 1973, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords. Officially, the war was over, but for those still fighting, it didn't feel that way. Even as troops began to withdraw, the battles continued. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese pressed forward, determined to take the South once and for all. And then came April 30th, 1975, the day the world watched Saigon fall. The last helicopters lifted off from the U.S. Embassy rooftop. Desperate South Vietnamese civilians clung to the landing skids, reaching for a seat, for salvation, for hope. As smoke rose from the city below, the image would haunt the world forever. The United States, the most powerful nation on earth, was leaving in defeat. Those left behind, soldiers, interpreters, families, faced an uncertain fate. Many were imprisoned. Many disappeared. The war had ended. But peace never came easily, and for those who returned home, the battlefield followed them. They came back to a country divided, a nation that didn't welcome them as heroes. There were no parades, no medals, only silence. Some Americans blamed them for the war. Others didn't want to talk about it at all. But for the men who had lived it, forgetting was impossible. The war had carved scars too deep for time to heal. Nightmares, flashbacks. The sound of rain became the sound of gunfire. The smell of smoke, a reminder of burning villages. Many veterans couldn't sleep. Some couldn't live with the memories at all. They had survived the jungle, but they couldn't escape the ghosts that followed them home. In Vietnam, we left more than bodies behind. We left a part of ourselves we'll never get back. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all, that in the end, there was no victory. Not for the soldiers who fought, not for the families who waited, not for the country that spent years fighting a war it could not win. The Vietnam War claimed over 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians. Cities were destroyed, jungles burned, and generations were left to pick up the pieces. But even through the pain, there were moments of humanity. Soldiers who carried wounded enemies to safety. Medics who risked their lives for strangers. Friendships born in the darkest of places. Because even in war, there's something unbreakable about the human spirit. Today, the jungles of Vietnam have grown quiet again. Nature has reclaimed the scars. The trees stand tall where bombs once fell. The rivers run clear where blood once flowed. And yet, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the whispers of those who never came home. They were young, they were brave, they were lost. but they were never forgotten. The Vietnam War wasn't just a battle for land. It was a battle for humanity, a reminder of how far war can take us from it, and how long it takes to find our way back. This was the story of the Vietnam War, a war with no victory and no peace. If you believe stories like these should never be forgotten, then remember to subscribe so that the voices of history can live on.